This is the story of Luís de Camões and his masterpiece, the Lusíadas, which is the greatest literary work in the Portuguese language.
Many countries have a national author. Shakespeare is the national author of England, Dante is the national author of Italy, and Cervantes is the national author of Spain. The national author of Portugal is Luís de Camões.
A lot about his life is unknown because few records of his time remain. Here is the reason.
On Sunday morning, November 1, 1755, an earthquake, tsunami, and the fire that followed destroyed much of Lisbon.
This disaster struck on All Saints' Day, when a large portion of the population of Catholic Lisbon was attending Mass. More than 60,000 people were killed. Nearly all the buildings housing public records were destroyed. The result was that few public records regarding Camões remain, meaning that any biography of him is almost certainly going to contain many errors. So what is known about Camões comes from only three sources. A few surviving documents that do mention him. Declarations contained in his first biographies, which were written in the 19th century, and some abstract and chronologically uncertain mentions about his own life that appear in Camões' works.
Camões was born in Lisbon around 1525, during the Renaissance.
Camões lived in a time when the Catholic Church dominated Portugal. The Church censored all literature. Further, the Inquisition relentlessly sought out all it deemed to be heresy, making being an author a risky occupation.
It was also the age of discovery in Portugal that occurred between 1418 and 1620.
During this epoch, the Portuguese established multiple trading posts in Asia and Africa and would discover and settle Brazil.
Before 1453, Constantinople was the entry point for Europe's import of spices from Asia. Without refrigeration, Europeans needed spices to preserve food and to mask the taste of spoiled food.
In 1453, the Muslims of the Ottoman Empire captured Christian Constantinople. The Ottomans renamed the city Istanbul. The Ottomans blocked European access to the Asian spice market. Without spices, food would become quickly inedible, which led to hunger in Europe. In 1497, Portuguese King Manuel I decided to bypass the land route to Asia that the Ottomans had blocked. He charged Vasco da Gama to find a sea route to Asia. Da Gama's fleet sailed from Lisbon in 1497.
In 1498, Vasco da Gama became the first European to make it to Asia, navigating around the south end of Africa. Vasco da Gama arrived in India that same year. Afterwards, the Portuguese dominated the spice trade until the 17th century. Camões was a member of the old aristocracy of Portugal, but without wealth. While he was poor, his membership in the nobility did provide him with valuable contacts in high places.
From the age of 12, Camões was educated in his youth by his paternal uncle, Dom Bento de Camões, who was the chancellor of the University of Coimbra. Coimbra is Portugal's oldest and most prestigious university. Although Coimbra has no record of Camões as a student, he almost certainly did attend Coimbra. Camões reputedly was not a disciplined student. He was interested in literature and history, and in the end he did end up with a vast knowledge of literature and philosophy that few others of his day could match. When Camões was 20, he moved back to Lisbon. In Lisbon, he adopted a bohemian lifestyle, frequenting taverns and getting involved in a variety of tumultuous love affairs. After one of his love affairs went particularly wrong, Camões enlisted as a soldier.
In 1415, the Portuguese captured the Muslim city of Ceuta in Morocco. It was the first Portuguese conquest in Africa. Part of the battle occurred as a naval battle fought in the Strait of Gibraltar. Camões lost an eye in that battle. The taking of Ceuta was the start of the Portuguese Empire. In 1553, Camões hurt an official of the royal court in a street brawl, and Camões went to jail. Don John III pardoned Camões on the condition that he enter the king's service in India. Camões sailed from Lisbon in 1653. He made almost the same voyage that Vasco da Gama had made 50 years earlier. His fleet ran into a violent storm as it rounded the Cape of Good Hope and lost 2 ships. Camões arrived at the Portuguese colony Goa in India in 1534. He spent the next 17 years in Asia. Therefore, unlike the other great national authors, Camões really saw and experienced the places his works describe. For instance, Shakespeare wrote Romeo and Juliet without ever visiting Italy. In Goa, Camões enlisted in the military and participated in at least 2 naval expeditions. Probably because of a satire over the corruption in Goa that Camões was accused of writing, he was jailed for a while in Goa. In 1562, Don Francisco Coutinho, the governor of India, appointed Camões the chief custodian of abandoned property in the Portuguese colony of Macau, China. Camões held this position from 1563 until 1565. His job was to confiscate the property of people who had died without heirs and those who had departed the colony and left property behind. When Camões was in Asia, he acquired a female slave and wrote a beautiful poem about her. It is notable that it is the first time that a white man expressed love for a black woman. Here are a few lines from that poem. That captive holds me captive. I have never seen a rose in soft bunches that to my eyes was more beautiful. When people see her black hair, they lose the opinion that blondes are beautiful. Love from blackness so sweet a figure that the snow swears it will change its color. This is the captive who holds me captive. Camões started to write Lusíadas in a cave while he was in Macau. Camões decided to return to Goa with his yet unfinished manuscript. During his voyage there, Camões' caravel shipwrecked on the coast of Cambodia. According to tradition, Camões swam to the beach, holding his manuscript of Lusíadas out of the water. Now, I need to mention at this point that I have seen some scholarly work expressing doubt as to whether Camões really could have swum to shore with one arm and hold his manuscript out of the water with the other. But it is such an oft-repeated, beloved story, I would be remiss if I didn't report it here. Camões was stranded there for several months. However, he was rescued. His rescue ship goes to the Portuguese outpost of Malacca, where he is jailed for a while for stealing the property he had collected in his previous job. After Camões is released from jail in Malacca, he returns to Goa. In 1567, Pedro Barreto is appointed governor of Mozambique Island. Barreto persuades Camões to accompany him there with the false promise that Camões will be able to easily get transport back to Lisbon. Unfortunately, there was nothing for Camões on Mozambique Island. He quickly accumulated a lot of debt and fell into poverty. 2 years later, in 1569, Camões' friend Diogo do Couto finds him destitute and without money to return to Portugal. Diogo and other friends pay for Camões' return. Camões arrived back in Lisbon in 1560 with his manuscript for Os Lusíadas. The poem is very long. The version I have is more than 200 pages long, single space, small print. It is divided into 10 cantos and 1,102 verses, and a lot of it can only be understood by those with a scholar's knowledge of Portuguese history and Greco-Roman mythology. Lusiadas comes from Lusitania, the ancient Roman name for Portugal. Lusitania received its name from Lucis, who, according to Portuguese mythology, was the son of Bacchus, the Roman god of wine. According to legend, Lucis founded ancient Lusitania. Os Lusíadas means the son of Lucis. Therefore, Lucis symbolizes the Portuguese people. Camões mentions him several times in Os Lusíadas. Os Lusíadas is written in the literary style of classicism. In this style, the poem intertwines classical Greek-Roman mythology and actual Portuguese history. While the poem has a variety of side topics, this video is only going to cover its story of Gama's voyage to India. The epic portrays the pagan gods as profoundly involved in human affairs, especially in the voyage of Vasco da Gama. Jupiter convenes a council of the gods to discuss the fate of Vasco da Gama. Bacchus, the god of wine, opposes the mission because he fears that the success of the Portuguese will diminish his influence in Asia. Venus, the goddess of love, supports the mission because the courage of the Portuguese reminds her of the Romans. Venus persuades Jupiter, the king of the gods, to support the mission. Even so, Bacchus still resolves to sabotage the mission, but Venus resolves to rescue them from Bacchus's plots. The present-day Lisbon neighborhood of Belém was originally called Estelo. Now, if you've ever been to Lisbon, you probably have visited Belém, because that's where a lot of the touristy stuff is. And the residential area of Belém is still called Estelo. Anyway, back in those days, the whole thing was called Estelo, and Vasco's fleet readies itself to sail from Estelo Harbor. At that moment, the venerated old man of Estelo appears. Camões writes, "A venerated old man who was on the beaches among us. Eyes are set on us, shaking 3 times the head, discontented. The heavy voice a little raising, that we at sea heard clearly. With knowledge gained only from experience, he drew such words from his learned chest. To what new disasters do you determine to lead this kingdom and these people? What dangers, what deaths do you intend for them? Under what preeminent name, what promises of kingdoms, of gold mines will you make to them so easily? What fame will you promise them? What stories, what triumphs, what applause, what victories?" Despite the old man's warnings, Vasco da Gama sails out of Lisbon's port. The fleet sails past Madeira, the Canaries, and Cape Verde, then out into the Atlantic, but following the east coast of Africa. They cross into the southern hemisphere, where they see a waterspout and the Southern Cross. They go ashore on the east coast of Africa and begin to negotiate with the locals for supplies. However, the next day, the Africans attacked. The Portuguese had to rapidly retreat. Recall that when Camões' fleet rounded the Cape of Good Hope, they lost 2 ships in a violent storm. Witnessing that disaster likely inspired what is surely the most memorable episode of the poem. When the fleet arrived at the Cape of Good Hope, a black cloud formed above, and the giant Adamastor appeared in it. Camões describes what happens. It was not over. When a figure appears to us in the air, robust and strong, a disfigured and very large stature, a heavy face, a squalid beard, sunken eyes, and a posture ghastly and evil, and an earthly and pale color, hair full of dirt and frizzy, a black mouth, yellow teeth. It was so large in limbs that I can assure you that this was the second of the strange Colossus of Rhodes, one of the 7 miracles of the world. He spoke to us in a tone of voice horrible and thick that seemed to come from the deep sea. My flesh and hair stand on end for me and everyone else just hearing and seeing him. He shouts that he is going to punish them for their audacity to enter what he calls the Cape of Storms. But Da Gama stands up to him and demands to know who he is. He answered that he was a Titan and a sea captain who took part on the losing side of a sea battle between the gods. Further, he fell in love with the nymph Thetis. Doris, the sea goddess and mother of Thetis, promised him her hand in marriage, but instead of that, she turned him into stone. Thus, as punishment for his rebellion against the god and his insolent love for Thetis, Adamastor was turned into a mountain. From there, he swears to impose his vengeance of every kind on any sailor who dares to pass by, his least vengeance being death. However, Adamastor ends up admiring Gama's courage. Adamastor opens the sky and lets Gama sail on in calm seas. The fleet reaches a city on the west coast of Mozambique, inhabited by a people Camões calls Moros. For Camões, all Muslims are Moros. However, Bacchus is determined to keep Gama from reaching India. Bacchus comes down to earth and assumes the form of a learned Mozambique sheik. He tells the king that the Portuguese are bloodthirsty Christian bandits who plan to rob and kill. To lure the Portuguese into a trap so they can destroy them, they greet them with great cordiality. Therefore, when the Portuguese come ashore to find water, the Moors try to ambush them. However, the Portuguese are seasoned warriors and are able to defend themselves. In response, Gama bombards the city. The Moors attack the fleet by sea, but the Moors only have lances, arrows, and stones. Gama destroys them with his cannons. Stunned, the king offers to furnish Gama a pilot to guide him to India, but with the intention that the pilot will lead Gama to his destruction. Gama is very suspicious, but he questions the offered pilot and he seems to be knowledgeable. So even though Gama feels unease, he reluctantly accepts the traitorous pilot from the king. This pilot treacherously guides Gama up the east coast of Africa to Mombasa, which he knows is hostile, but assuring Gama that it is Christian and friendly. Bacchus assumes human form and convinces the inhabitants to trick the Portuguese with friendliness and then destroy them. Then Bacchus assumes the form of a priest and assures that the city is Christian. Gama enters the port. In accordance with the plan, the king welcomes him warmly. Thinking they have lulled the Portuguese into letting down their guard, the Moors launch boats to go out and board the Portuguese ships. However, Venus sends favorable winds, enabling Gama to escape from the port, pursued hotly by the attacking boats of the Moors. Gama sails on up the coast of Africa until he arrives at Melinda, where he disembarks. The Sultan there welcomes Gama with great hospitality. The Sultan is greatly impressed by the advanced navigation skills of the Portuguese. At the request of the Sultan, Gama tells him the history of Portugal. The Sultan provided Gama with provisions, which he badly needed. The Sultan also provided them with an experienced pilot to guide them across the unknown waters to India. However, Bacchus convinces Neptune to send a violent storm to shipwreck his fleet. Venus intervenes, calling forth the Nereids to impede the fleet from entering the treacherous waters that Neptune had erupted in their path. Then she sends favorable winds to move the fleet to calm waters. On the morning after the storm, they can see the mountains on the coast of India. Then the majestic towers of the city of Calicut come into view. Gama's fleet is greeted by a curious but enthusiastic crowd. Gama sends a messenger into the city. Voyage, who really is a Moor, who is from Tangier, and who speaks Spanish, approaches. He expresses joy to hear the kindred language of Portuguese and offers to be their interpreter. Voyage visits Gama and describes India. He relates that India is a vast and diverse land that is rich in resources and cultural heritage. He describes the greatness of the rivers Ganges and Indus. The king's minister, the Gualtal, arrives and invites Gama for an audience with the king. The king receives Gama very cordially. Gama tells him he represents a great king and proposes an alliance between them for commerce and defense. The king responds that he has to think about the proposal. Bacchus appears as Mohammed in the dream of one of the king's advisors and warns him that the Portuguese are going to take over their land. The advisor rushes to the king with this warning. This warning scares the king. The king accuses Gama of being a pirate, and not only that, he didn't bring any valuable presents for him. Gama responds that when he returns from his country, he will bring a rich and noble present. The king is satisfied and orders Gama to be returned to his ship, and that he be allowed to return to sell his trade goods in the market. However, despite the king's orders, the Gualtal doesn't allow Gama to return to his ship. He tells Gama that to prove that they really want to trade and not wage war, they must bring all their merchandise to the market and sell it. Gama agrees. Gama is released and returns to his ships. The crew goes into the market and begins selling their trade goods. However, the sales are slow because the infidels are deliberately dragging them out. Their evil plan is to keep the Portuguese in Calicut until a Muslim fleet from Mecca can arrive to destroy them. Voyage alerts Gama to the trap, for which Camões declares that he deserves paradise. Voyage then becomes a Christian. Gama realizes that it is time to leave. When the Moors see that Gama is getting ready to leave, they take prisoners as sailors who were selling in the market. In response, Gama takes as his hostages important merchants of the city. The families of these hostages implore the king to free the Portuguese. The king frees the prisoners to the fleet, along with the spices they had purchased. Gama frees some of his hostages, but keeps some of them as additional proof that he had been in India. Then he sets sail for Lisbon. At this point, Venus decides to reward the gallant Portuguese for their courage. She places an enchanted island in their way inhabited by nymphs. Venus enlists the help of her son Cupid. He peppers them with arrows of love. With the nymphs under the influence of Cupid's arrows, Venus brings the Portuguese to them to be their lovers. The voyage ends when Gama's fleet enters Lisbon harbor. Camões published his masterpiece, the epic poem Os Lusíadas, in 1572 when he was 48. This poem is universally considered to be the greatest literary work in the Portuguese language.
Camões read Lusíadas to Don Sebastián I, who was still a teenager. Don Sebastián ordered the work to be published. King Sebastián also granted Camões a small pension for Luís de Camões, noble knight of my house, in return for services rendered in India. Lusíadas, with all its references to Greco-Roman gods, had to be approved by the Holy Office of the Inquisition. Almost surprisingly, the censor declared, "It is not possible to think heresy because it does not make sense in the time of the Counter-Reformation to believe in the pantheon of Greco-Roman gods." There are indications that this pension may have been irregularly paid. While there is some disagreement among scholars as to extent, Camões likely struggled financially the rest of his life. One reason to believe that Camões was not impoverished is that he had a Javan slave, João, whose Christian name was Antonio. It is believed that Camões bought him during his stay on Mozambique Island. However, another version of this account is that João supported both of them by begging in the street. Rua João in Lisbon is named after him. The Marquis de Pombal abolished slavery in Portugal, but not in its colonies, in 1761. Rua João now represents a tribute to the enslaved people of Lisbon. Camões died on June 10, 1580, at the age of 55. Camões was so little appreciated during his life that no one bothered to remember where he was buried. One possibility was in the Santa Ana convent, which was close to where he lived. Another possibility was the pauper cemetery close to the hospital where he died. Like so much else about Camões, there are three accounts of what caused his death. One account is that he died of the bubonic plague. A second account is that he succumbed to the exhaustion brought on by the hard life that he led. A third account is that he died from a broken heart because Portugal lost its independence to Spain. While far from certain, the broken heart account entails a horrifying catastrophe that virtually every biography of Camões mentions. Lusíadas may be seen as a plea for the return to the glory days of Portuguese expansionism. Returning to the glory days and expansionism were sentiments shared by Don Sebastián. To the great misfortune of both him and Portugal, Don Sebastián got the chance. Abu Abdullah Muhammad II became the Sultan of Morocco in 1574 after the death of his father. His uncle Abd al-Malik, with the help of the Ottoman Turks, deposed him in 1576. Abu fled to Portugal and persuaded Don Sebastián to help him regain his sultanate with promises of favorable trade and maybe even the expansion of Christianity. Don Sebastián organized an army of 17,000 men, including almost all the Portuguese nobility, along with many foreign mercenaries hired from the Holy Roman Empire. The two armies met in Morocco at Qasr al-Kabir on August 4, 1578, in what is sometimes called the Battle of the Three Kings. The battle lasted for nearly 4 hours of brutal fighting, ending with the complete defeat of the Portuguese army, in which 8,000 died, including the slaughter of almost all of Portugal's nobility. Don Sebastián was last seen charging headlong into enemy lines. His body was never identified with certainty, which left the eternally hopeful long unconvinced of his death. There was no clear successor to Don Sebastián, who had died childless and without siblings. Don Sebastián's oldest cousin, King Philip II of Spain, became one of the 7 pretenders who laid claim to the Portuguese throne. In June of 1580, Philip's 40,000-man Spanish army entered Portugal under the command of Don Fernando Alvarez de Toledo, Duke of Alba, entering the War of Portuguese Succession. As the Spanish advanced into Portugal, it is said that Camões died of despair on June 10, 1580, at the prospect of Portugal losing its independence to Spain, allegedly uttering these last words: "All will see that so dear to me was my country, I was content to die not only in it, but with it." Ultimately, Philip II made good his claim to the Portuguese throne when the army of the Duke of Alba entered Lisbon on August 27, 1580. The Spanish king, Philip II, then became the king of both Spain and Portugal. Ironically, Philip appreciated and promoted Lusiadas far more than Sebastian, who reportedly judged it to be merely adequate. Now, I want to say a few words on Sebastian's behalf here, because in English, adequate kind of implies, just barely enough. But in Portuguese, adequado means appropriate, fitting, what is called for. It's far more than the faint praise of adequate in English. The entire Iberian Peninsula became the Iberian Union in 1580 under Spanish rule. Portugal did not regain its independence from this hated Spanish rule until 60 years later in 1640. The 1775 Lisbon earthquake brought down Santa Ana's convent. An attempt was made afterward to find Camões' grave under the rubble, but without success. Lisbon celebrated the tricentennial of Camões' death in 1880. To commemorate the occasion, it was decided to move the remains of Camões and Vasco da Gama to elaborate tombs in Jeronimo's monastery. The uncertainty as to whose remains they disinterred to occupy Camões' tomb did not deter them. Jeronimo's monastery is located in the harborside parish of Lisbon called Belém. It became the repository for the tombs of some of Portugal's royalty. The tombs of Camões and da Gama were placed close to each other in Jeronimo's monastery. Imagine the joy it would have brought Camões to have known that his tomb would one day be placed close to that of his adored Vasco da Gama. Camões has had an unequaled impact on the literature and traditions of the Portuguese-speaking world. Today, the stone figure of Adamastor scowls at Lisbon Harbor from Santa Catarina Overlook instead of from the Cape of Storms. The Camões Prize is the highest literary award for authors of literature written in Portuguese. His works are included in the educational curriculum in Portugal, assuring that each new generation study and appreciate his contributions to Portuguese literature. There is a prominent plaza in Lisbon, named in Camões' honor, with a large statue of him in the middle. The date of Camões' death, June the 10th, is the National Day of Portugal. Camões has become and will remain the very symbol of the rich culture of Portugal. Thanks for watching.